Visit us at Eduvvo. Thank you for calling Eduvvo.
CSS includes properties that give us the ability to create rounded and elliptical corners on elements without the need for any images. In this video, we'll learn how to make our rectangular box elements smooth and round with the border radius property. Let's get started. With the border radius properties, we can easily create rounded corners in our design elements without the need for images or the use of multiple div tags or other nested elements like we would use in the past. We can use border radius to define exactly how rounded the corners appear. In our markup, we have a simple div element with the class roundedBox, which, as we can see in the browser, has no rounded corners just yet. So first, let's apply the rounded corners to each individual corner, because we can specify custom border radius values for each corner of a box. The border radius property is actually the shorthand property for border top left radius, border top right radius, border bottom right radius, and border bottom left radius. The curve of each corner is created using one or two values that define its shape, which can either be a circle or an ellipse. Even if the element does not have a border applied, the radius we define still gets applied if the element has a background property set and vice versa. So let's go ahead and assign a rounded corner value to each of our divs for corners. The border radius values we assign can be any length unit or a percentage. So for our top left radius, we'll give it a value of 30 pixels. We'll give our top right radius a value of 10 pixels. Our border bottom right radius will get a radius of 30 pixels, and once again a value of 10 pixels for our border bottom left radius. When we refresh this in the browser, there we see the smooth 30 pixel radius for our top left and bottom right corners, and the 10 pixel radius for the top right and bottom left corners. When we use a percentage, the value refers to the corresponding dimensions of the box. So if we change the border top left and border bottom right radius to 100%, when we refresh the browser, notice how the rounded corners take up 100% of the top left and bottom right corners. And if we change the value to 50%, it takes up half. Keep in mind that negative values are not allowed for any length units or percentages. So let's quickly go over how the corners are actually formed. The rounded corners are formed from the radius of a quarter circle. In our example image here, the quarter section of the circles is what forms the rounded shape of this box. The rounding of the corners doesn't always have to be perfectly circular. In addition to a single value, these border radius properties can also accept a second value so that we can specify elliptical corners like we see here. When two values are used, the first value is the horizontal radius and the second is the vertical radius. The two values combined define the curvature of the corner, which results in a quarter ellipse or elliptical curve if both values are different. So let's go back to our CSS file and add two values to the top left and bottom right corners. So here, our horizontal radius is 80 pixels and the vertical radius is 40 pixels. The same applies for the bottom right radius value. In the browser, we can see that our top left and bottom right corners are no longer perfectly rounded and instead have an elliptical shape. If we overlay an ellipse over the top left and bottom right corners, we can see exactly how the corners are shaped using these values. So each quarter ellipse is 80 pixels wide and 40 pixels tall. When using percentages, the horizontal percentage value will refer to the width of the box, and the vertical percentage value will refer to the height of the box. So let's go ahead and change our values here to 50%, 20%. We'll do the same for the bottom right corner. We'll refresh this, and we can see that now our top left and bottom right corners are 50% of the width of the box and 20% of the height. As I mentioned earlier, the radius is applied to the whole background. So that means that all border styles like solid, dotted, inset, and dash will always follow the curve of the border, as we can see here. As we already know, we don't need to define an individual property for each corner. We can define all values instead using the border radius shorthand property. When one value is used, the radius applies to all four corners. It defines both the horizontal and vertical radii equally. So here we see the value 30 pixels is applied to each corner of our box. When two values are used, the first value is applied to the top left and bottom right corners, and the second value is applied to the top right and bottom left corners. So now the top left and bottom right corners are rounded, but the bottom left and top right are not. They're squared. When three values are defined, the first value only applies to the top left corner. The second value is applied to the top right and bottom left corners. And the third value only applies to the bottom right corner. So now the second value of 0 is the only one that gets applied to the two corners. And now the bottom right corner has a 60 pixel radius. Finally, when four values are defined, each value applies to one of the four corners. So let's think clockwise here. The first value is applied to the top left corner, the second is applied to the top right, the third will be applied to the bottom right, and the fourth value is applied to the bottom left corner. So there we see that each corner has the individual value applied. When using the shorthand property, if we need to set a horizontal and vertical radius for each corner, we can do this by using a / between the two sets of values. So the first set of values defines the horizontal radius of each corner, and the second set defines the vertical radius of each corner. Each of the two sets can have up to four values, one for each corner. So here we're giving each corner a horizontal radius of 50 pixels and a vertical radius of 100 pixels. And there we see what that looks like. So let's see what happens when we add a second value to each set. So we'll add a value of 100 pixels, then make our vertical set 25 and 50 pixels. So here a horizontal radius of 50 pixels is being applied to the top left and bottom right corners, while the top right and bottom left corners will have a horizontal radius of 100 pixels. In the vertical set of values, a 25 pixel radius will be applied to the top left and bottom right corners, and a radius of 50 pixels will be applied to the top right and bottom left corners. In our browser, we can see that the bottom left and top right corners have the larger horizontal and vertical values applied, while the other two corners have the smaller values applied. We really shouldn't get more complex than this unless we're creating certain shapes, because we can create some really interesting shapes using border radius. So let's go ahead and create a few shapes of our own. Back in our CSS, let's go ahead and start by creating a perfectly rounded circle. So we'll change the width to 200 and the height to 200. And we will apply a border radius of 50%. And when we refresh, we can see that 50% will always give us a perfect circle as long as the width and height values are the same. So now let's go ahead and create an oval shape. So we'll reduce the height from 200 to 100 pixels, and we will give each corner a horizontal radius of 100 pixels and a vertical radius of 50 pixels. Now in our browser, there we see our oval shape created with those values. Next, let's go ahead and create the shape of a lemon. So we'll change the height back to 200 pixels. And let's go ahead and change the background color here to a hex value of yellow. Then we'll apply a different border radius to each side of our box. So now let's refresh this, and there we see our lemon shape created with those values. We can apply the border radius property to most HTML elements. Chrome and Safari, however, do not support border radius on video elements. Today, the border radius property is supported in all major browsers, including IE9 and above. Coming up in the next video, we'll learn how to create realistic-looking box shadows with CSS.